This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 774 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into this week's mailbag questions, folks, the Late Round Draft Guide drops in 1 week. So you have one more week to get the discounted rate of $19.99. Next Friday, June 30th, that's going to jump to $24.99. The guide includes some deep fantasy football strategy and new market trends that I really haven't talked about on this podcast before. There's a section on players to target, players to avoid, and late round dart throws, and my top 200 rankings are in the guide too. The guide is updated weekly through August and sent to your email inbox every single week. Those updates are for all the players to target, avoid, and the late round darts, as well as my rankings list. It's what you need to dominate your drafts this year. So make sure you pre-order right now over on lateround.com. The first question this week is from @FantasyBackup2. It says, why aren't replacement level players taken at the same point in drafts? Why don't the QB 12, RB 24, wide receiver 36, tight end 12 have roughly similar ADPs? Okay, so when you go into a fantasy draft, there are really two questions you're asking at each position. The first is, of all the players remaining at this position, which one's going to score the most points? Once you answer that question, you then ask, how many more points is this player going to score versus the rest of his position? The first question is within the same position. You might like Bijan Robinson this year more than Austin Eckler, so you're drafting Robinson over Eckler. But the second question is essentially value over replacement, and you can compare that across positions. You might like Robinson more than Eckler, but by how much? Could you pass on running back and still get value in the next round? What if every single season, the QB1 scored just one more point than the QB2, who scored one more point than the QB3, and so on, all the way to QB20, let's say. And then pretend everything else was the same. You're in a single quarterback league. The way we project running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, that's no different. It's the same world. You would never draft a quarterback early in this scenario. Ever. The QB1 is barely giving you any sort of edge over the rest of the position. So if you're in a 12-team league, you'd likely want to wait at quarterback. And every other team in your league would also want to wait at quarterback. It would be more advantageous in that scenario to get your third, fourth, fifth, sixth running back before getting your quarterback. Because with the running back position, there's volatility. Your projections aren't going to be perfect. An 8th round running back could hypothetically outperform a 2nd round one. That's not going to happen at quarterback in this scenario. We already know how the quarterbacks are going to finish. And we already know that the edge that they're going to give us in points per game is irrelevant. So you might as well take the chance on some running back depth instead of getting even the QB1. Because no matter how you measure replacement level, that QB1 is not giving you much of an advantage over the rest of the position whatsoever. I know, this is not how we draft players. This isn't how it works. But the idea is absolutely how it works. Fantasy football is not a linear game. When we're drafting players, we're thinking about variance, volatility, and how much of an edge these guys are giving our teams versus the rest of their position. Because supply and demand dictates that we need more running backs and wide receivers, it makes total sense to sometimes draft backups before starters at tight end and quarterback. Because there are pockets in your draft where the edge that a certain player is giving you just is not significant. And when it's not significant, you shouldn't draft that player. Imagine you're in round 5. Let's say that you had 4 quarterbacks who were all projected to be really, really good this year. But the rest of the quarterbacks were the exact same. They all had similar projections. Are you going to just take the QB5 after those 4 quarterbacks are off the board just because you need a quarterback? Of course not. There's no reason to. If every other quarterback is projected to perform exactly alike, it makes far more sense to just not draft that position until your final pick. That's why these baselines aren't getting drafted in the same spot. Fantasy football drafts are not linear. This next one's from @Armando68282753. So much hype for Darren Waller this upcoming year. What is your projection for the 2023 season? I started this offseason lower on Waller than I am right now. Doing more research for the draft guide, he hits a lot on the market-related trends that you look for in a player who can exceed his average draft position expectation. One of those things being that he's the top pass catcher on his team by ADP. No other New York Giant pass catcher is being drafted ahead of Darren Waller. That signals to us that he could be in store for a nice target share. Middle round tight ends like that have exceeded expectation by a much larger margin than middle round tight ends who haven't been their team's top pass catcher. Now, my projections were updated earlier this week. Waller's currently the tight end 6 within those projections. He's moving up my rankings just based on all that research. Now, last year was a little rough for his health, but in his 3 prior seasons, he was at or above a 23.5% target share per game rate. And while his yards per route run did drop a little bit last year, it didn't fall to horrific levels. It was still at 1.58. Usually I get a little bit more concerned when that tight end yards per route run rate is below 1.5. Now, I totally understand if you want to go with a late round tight end approach this year instead of getting someone like Waller. Just given opportunity cost. But there are things pointing in his favor. The next question is from @HeyDavid_FF. It says, are you more open to handcuffing running backs in dynasty leagues with deep benches where the waiver wire is very thin? How about quarterbacks in a superflex league? I'm far more inclined to do it at running back than at quarterback. I think having high-end backup quarterbacks in superflex leagues, totally fine. But you're far from guaranteed good production from a random backup quarterback. Talent drives that position more so than at running back, by far. Which means that running back handcuffs can hypothetically perform better than quarterback handcuffs would. But the topic of handcuffing is always a tough one to talk about, because definitions are all over the place. How are you defining a handcuff? Is Jaylen Warren a handcuff? Because I would not consider him a handcuff. He's going to see work in the Steelers' offense even when Najee Harris is healthy. Is Samaje Perine a handcuff? I don't think anyone would consider him that. A true handcuff to me is someone who's worthless without an injury. I think it's more than fine to get the Jaylen Warren type players who project to be maybe a flex play every once in a while, but have the upside to be a starting running back with an injury. I think you can do that in redraft leagues. All of the handcuff work that I've done in the past, and this is like 5 or 6 years ago at this point, it's been around the guys who aren't getting work without an injury to their starter. And typically, when those guys are called upon, when they finally get work, they don't do as well as we think. They're backups for a reason. But most running back backups, especially higher end ones, they should be rostered in Dynasty, yes. Now, I don't necessarily need to target my own running back's backups. If my team is really good, if I'm in good shape, maybe that's fine. Because it's a floor play. It's a safety play. It's insurance. The ceiling play would be to get backups for running backs not on my fantasy team. Because then if an injury happens to their starter, you all of a sudden have another viable running back on your roster. It's the upside play. And I usually chase upside. That's the way that I play fantasy football. And this is basically the way that I handle handcuffs halfway through a redraft season. It's usually not necessary to force yourself to trade for and overspend for a handcuff on your team. Like if you have Najee Harris, don't overspend for Jaylen Warren. Jaylen Warren's value is the same whether you have Najee Harris or not. I know that people are going to get angry about that, but it's true. It's just a matter if you look at it from an upside perspective or a floor perspective. If your team's in great shape and you want some insurance, sure, go get Jaylen Warren if you have Najee Harris. But if your team needs a little bit more volatility, get Jaylen Warren if you don't have Najee Harris. And for quarterbacks, I wouldn't be getting backups unless they're young, have a shot to start, or have proven to be good fantasy assets at one point in their career. Like someone like Gardner Minshew is fine. He might get a shot. We don't know what's going to happen with Anthony Richardson. But I'm not going to roster someone like Davis Mills or Easton Stick, unless you're in some ultra deep league. The last question this week is from @FantasyBoosters. It says, current ADP has a seemingly brighter/hopeful pool of running backs in the dead zone for 2023. What is your perception of this range of running backs this season, and do you think it will hold as we move through the summer? We honestly do this every single year. Every year we tell ourselves that this season, the running backs out of the dead zone are actually good. And then they underperform. I've done episodes on the running back dead zone in the past, and I talk about it at length in the late round draft guide. To me, the dead zone is an area of your fantasy draft where two things happen. Running back hit rates drop and wide receiver hit rates tend to be better. Let's just focus on the first part though. Let's look at running back hit rates because they do drop. They get worse. It's not that every running back is going to fail, but collectively, backs out of the dead zone don't perform much better, if at all, than backs right after the dead zone. In fact, according to the ADP data that I work with from my fantasy league, round 7 running backs have provided more of a ceiling since 2011 than round 4 ones. Now, my ADP source, so my fantasy league, it says that around pick 30 of a 12-team league through pick 72 is generally where these dead zone running backs live. That's not going to be the same from one platform to the next. It's not going to be identical. Like if you're doing best ball drafts right now on Underdog, their ADP is super wide receiver heavy. So the dead zone is different. But the dead zone exists in every single draft. I think this is very key to understand. You just have to start to think about it differently. Now, I keep mentioning how hit rates drop, which they do. But the hit rates drop not from an overall ADP perspective. It's not always pick 30 to pick 72. They drop from a positional perspective too. After about the RB12 gets drafted, conveniently the RB12, you start to see worse hit rates from running backs. So on Underdog, for instance, the RB15 might go later than where the RB15 is going to go in your home league. But that RB15 is still a worse bet to make compared to the RB30, just in terms of the point advantage that you're gaining. It's just that it's a lot easier to draft that dead zone running back on a platform like Underdog where the opportunity cost is much lower because that RB15 is going later. Now imagine a world where the RB15 got drafted in the middle of round 2. Like it was a super running back heavy draft. That running back doesn't really escape the dead zone because he's going in round 2 all of a sudden. Your opportunity cost just changes. It gets greater. It's greater when you take that running back in round 2 as opposed to round 6. And his hit rate historically has not been nearly as good as even just the RB12. So he's still technically part of this dead zone area. It's just that in that particular home league draft where he goes in round 2, the dead zone is earlier. And it's a bigger deal because opportunity cost is a lot greater. My point with all this is to say that the running back dead zone is going to exist to some degree in every single draft. Because running back hit rates become much flatter around that transition from RB1 to RB2. From top 12 running backs to the next 12. So don't necessarily just look at overall ADP when you're searching for the dead zone backs. Look at running back positional ADP. And yeah, there are some standard RB2s this year that look like decent bets. I think Rachaad White makes sense. Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be on a lot of my teams. And I get into why in the draft guide. But I got a very, very similar question to this last year. And only Josh Jacobs, Breece Hall, and Dameon Pierce really emerged from the dead zone. 2 of those guys were rookies, which is something I've noted that you should be looking for with your dead zone backs. Now, according to the data that I work with, we had 10 players not give you much of an edge at all from that range last year. You had guys like Zeke, David Montgomery, Antonio Gibson, J.K. Dobbins, A.J. Dillon, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Cam Akers, Elijah Mitchell. People thought that the dead zone last year looked good. It clearly did not come to fruition. But don't think that every running back out of the dead zone is doomed. That's not how this works. This is about probability. There are going to be running backs who come out of the dead zone who are effective. There are every single year. But market trends tell us that it's usually a pretty rough place to find high ceiling players. You're just as well off waiting a round or two to find those players. And I would bet that this year is going to be no different. We'll see some guys who break out, but the hit rates still look pretty poor, at least when it comes to ceiling. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Remember to pre-order that draft guide because next week the price does go up, but enjoy your weekend, and I'll talk to you next week.